Today. Let's see, we are live. Let me just do a quick check here. I just want to make sure that everything's broadcasting all right. Truth be told, this is my first time running this exact setup for a live stream, so I just want to want to make sure that we've got everything configured correctly. Um, so let me just see here. I believe this is working. How about this? Why don't you pop in the chat and let me know if you can see me and hear me. Would love to would love to know. In the meantime, let us get started. So, hello everyone. If you don't know me already, my name is Tyler, and I'm going to be hosting today's live stream on combating content creep. So, yeah, really excited to jam with y'all today. If you have questions as we're going through everything today, feel free to pop that in the chat. Again, you should be able to chat either on LinkedIn or on YouTube, wherever you're watching this. Um, and I think hopefully I should be able to see any of those chat messages. Okay, well, without any further ado, let's get into it and let's talk about today's topic. So, content creep. This is something that I've been hearing more and more about as I've talked to lots of different content teams and content leaders. Is that essentially in this moment right now, what's happening for content folks is that we're seeing this kind of exponential growth in content demands, channels, and formats. So we have to make more content, or people are asking us to make more content in a broader variety of contexts and formats and for a broader variety of channels. And at the same time, there is no growth or potentially a decrease in time and budget. So what we're facing is sort of this existential challenge of, okay, how do we keep up with all of these demands? How do we make all of this content that people are asking for without getting more budget or more resources or more time? Obviously, a lot of people are going to tell you to use AI. We're not going to talk about using AI today. Yes, AI can improve some of your efficiency and some of your processes. That's not what we're talking about today, though. What we're talking about is, how do we think about this at the strategy level? How do we really take a step back and say, what are we really trying to achieve here as a content leader, as a content team, and what's the best way to pursue that outcome? So let's get into some of the things that we can do uh, in order to make that happen. So, first of all, tracing back the idea of content creep, like, what are some of the forces that are driving this trend right now? Number one is uncertainty. Okay, so there's a lot of uncertainty happening right now around content marketing, around SEO in particular, and the big problem that a lot of teams are facing is that the SEO playbooks that have worked for 5 or 10 or 15 years are no longer a reliable source of traffic, leads, revenue, and growth. Right. So we used to have very deliberate and specific and repeatable playbooks. We used to be able to rely on SEO basically to always sort of go up as long as we were continuing to invest time and money in that content and those keywords and that strategy. And now with all of the changes happening, changes in the algorithm, changes with AI and AI overviews, changes in consumer behavior and the way that we discover and find information, that is no longer the case for many companies. And in fact, many companies are seeing a decline in search traffic, often for the first time in 5 or 10 years, that their traffic has gone down. And so the outcome for that inside many teams is that they start trying a little bit of everything, right? They say, okay, oh crap, this thing that we've been doing isn't working in the same way. How do we make up for that? How do we get back our traffic? How do we get our traffic from some other sources? Whatever it is. And they don't necessarily have a clear playbook for what that's going to look like. And so they start kind of throwing things at the wall, doing a little bit of this, doing a little bit of that, try this, try that. And what they're trying to do is sort of make up for any of that lost traffic, lost revenue, lost conversions, etc. So that's one thing that's happening right now. The other thing is unreasonable expectations, right? We touched on AI a little bit. Again, obviously, that's sort of in the background for this entire conversation. Uh, but right now, what's realistically happening inside most teams is that your CEO or your CFO or your VP of marketing or some executive probably thinks AI can create infinite free content, right? It's a blank check. You just use AI and we can make whatever we want, as much as we want, as fast as we want. Uh, we all know, everyone who works in content and sort of is on the ground here knows that that's not really the case. As I said, I'm not an anti AI person. I am an advocate for using AI in many, many ways and use cases. But the reality is that it's not a blank check. It's not going to make up for this the macro trends that we're seeing inside content teams right now. But the outcome from this mindset happening inside teams is that people just keep stacking more and more and more work on your plate, right? They say just use AI. You can just use AI and we can 10x our output. We can put out way more blog posts if we just use AI. Uh, while again, there may be some truth to that. There are a lot of trade-offs and sacrifices that are being made if that's your solution. The other problem is sort of envy, and this is sort of a compounding kind of circular challenge, right? So as more teams are dealing with that uncertainty, they're also looking around at what all their competitors are doing or what other people are doing in totally different industries in some cases. And inevitably, right, what happens is John sees that our competitors are showing up in AI, but we're not. Or Susan sees that all of our competitors have a podcast and we don't. And so the outcome of that is, once again, an explosion of content demands or requests or pressure to do more. So start optimizing our site for ChatGPT, start a podcast. Why aren't we putting out data reports? Whatever they're seeing in the market, people are sort of reflecting back on the content team and asking, why aren't we doing that too? And so obviously the implicit or perhaps explicit uh, connotation there is, on top of everything else, we should also be doing these other things. And so we're just adding more and more and more plates to the stack. And so these are sort of the drivers that we're seeing right now that are leading to this content creep explosion. And so what ends up happening is that the content teams are stuck with a million different channels and formats and all these different things that they're expected to now own, right? So they're expected to be able to produce data reports and own Instagram and create TikToks and make reels and host a podcast and just do all of the things, right? Everything that everyone else is doing, we should be doing it too. So that's where we sort of find ourselves. The reality, of course, is that you can't do it all, right? Unless you're the magical content team that has an unlimited budget and unlimited resources. I don't think that actually exists. You can't do it all, even with AI. It's just not possible to keep up with all these demands. And in fact, it's it is self-sabotaging to even try, right? Because the reality is that it's an arms race. So if your competitors are doing all this stuff and you start using AI to try to keep up with them, when they start using AI to do even more, it's a self-perpetuating cycle, right? You're never going to be able to do it all, and you're never going to be able to do more than everyone else can do. AI is not a competitive advantage when everyone can use AI to achieve the same level of output, right? So we need to stop thinking about AI as the solution to this problem. Again, that's a circular line of logic, and it's never going to resolve itself. The true solution here, believe it or not, and bear with me for a second here, don't bite my head off quite yet, is a version of do more with less, right? So the everyone's every CFO's favorite saying for the last year has been do more with less. But in this case, we're going to flip that. We're going to flip this idea of do more with less, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But basically, this idea, although not in the way that your CFO probably thinks, is actually a solution here. So let's talk about how we flip that. So the way when someone says do more with less, what they usually mean is make more content with less time, budget, or resources. Right? Use AI to do this faster, to keep up with all of these demands without spending more money, or while spending less money in many cases. Right? But again, we've already talked about why that's not the solution here. The real solution is to flip that idea of more with less. Rather than more content with less time, let's talk about how do we create more value with less content. So again, we're not trying to outrun our competitors by doing more and more and more. We're trying to be more intentional and be more strategic and focused and targeted. So less content. I know that's going to sound counterintuitive, especially from a guy who makes a living selling content, but less content with more focus, and by creating more value with that content, we can actually achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve without chasing an impossible uh, output goal or quota. Okay, so we're going to talk about how we actually do that in practice. Before we get into it, I do want to do a very quick intro about myself, just to sort of set the stage and to give you a bit of context about where I'm coming from as I'm sharing these ideas and these frameworks. So my background is basically content marketing all the way down. I've been in content marketing for 15, going on 20 years now. I've worked, in house. I've worked at agencies. I've worked at consulting firms. I've led marketing for venture funded startups. I've done a little bit of everything, but the majority of my career has been uh, a founder and principal of the agency that I run, which is called Optimist. We work with all kinds of teams, lots of startups, but also larger companies as well. And so, what I'm going to be talking about today are sort of the lessons and the strategies and the frameworks that I've learned from working with probably over 150 different content teams over the last 8 or 9 years, plus conversations that I've had with hundreds, maybe even over 1,000 content leaders over that same amount of time, right? And so, just to give you context, we've worked, as I said, with lots of small Series A uh, startups, things like that. But we've also worked with many large companies like SEMrush and DreamHost and Gusto and ZoomInfo, and our friends at Stamply. And so, I feel like I have a fairly good perspective on what's happening, but that's something that I'm always trying to learn about is what is going on inside content teams right now, what's working, what's not working, what are some of the strategies that people are doing to sort of meet this moment. And so that's what we're going to be unpacking today is sort of the lessons that I've learned from having these conversations, from seeing inside lots of different content teams and being able to sort of stitch together the trends and the patterns around what are the operational and strategic decisions that lead to better outcomes and a more reasonable expectation around content and output and keeping up with all of these content demands. So the first thing that we're going to talk about really quick, I'm just going to pop over here into the chat. Once again, if you're in the chat, feel free, or if you could pop a message in the chat, that'd be super helpful for me just to make sure that everything is working okay technically. But yeah, let's let's get back to it. So message first frameworks. So this is something that I see that is sort of a strategic level shift that I think a lot of teams need to make at the moment, right? So uh, let's talk about how most content workflows happen inside companies. Usually, it's some variation of this simplified framework, right? So we start with a content request or a keyword or some sort of idea about, hey, we should write about this topic, and then we move that forward. We maybe write some content, and then we kind of figure out how do we connect this to some bigger message that we want to put out into the market, or how do we talk about our product in this article about what is content marketing or whatever. And so it's what I would call message last. And in a lot of teams, right, that is truly the case, that the message really comes last. And the last step in the process is how do we work our product in here? How do we better align this with our brand? How do we inject a CTA into this thing to try to drive conversions from it? And this process is problematic in a lot of ways. Not the least of which is that you have sort of this opportunity for a gross misalignment between the content and sort of the original idea and the final message that you're actually trying to put into the market. But the more important challenge here is that anything goes, right? We're starting with the content request, we're starting with the keyword. That basically means that your funnel is wide open, right? Any content idea that gets thrown at the wall, let's add it to the queue. Any keyword that lives in this spreadsheet, we're going to write that blog post, right? So there's no criteria by which to evaluate or prioritize the content that you're actually making. And in a lot of cases, it's not until you get all the way to that last step that you might realize, wait a minute, this doesn't really work. Or, we're targeting this keyword, but we sort of changed our positioning, or our product has evolved in such a way that this keyword isn't really relevant to the audience that we're trying to reach anymore. So there, again, there's all these challenges that come with this. But basically what we need to do at a macro level is we need to flip this process. Okay. So rather than starting with the content or keywords, what we need to think about is, what's the message? What are we trying to put out into the market? What are we trying to say? What do we want people to know about us, about the industry, about the problems that they're facing, whatever that message is. We want to get clear on what that message is first. Then we want to build a framework for when and how are we going to communicate these messages, and then we can define, okay, what are the tactics? What's the execution of that message? How do we put it out into the market? Is it through blog posts? Is it through a podcast? Is it through LinkedIn carousels? Whatever it is, right? But that part really needs to come last. And so the big picture here is that having this sort of focused message has two main benefits from a strategy and kind of operations perspective. Number one is it creates kind of this natural boundary, right? So if you've got 100 content ideas or requests, which if you work in an in-house team, you probably have 100 content requests. That's probably on the low end, right? At any one time. Uh, how do you decide which ones to do, which ones to ignore, and how to prioritize those things? Well, if you don't have a framework or a system by which to sort of say what's in and what's out, then there's no logical way to do it. So the first thing that having a sort of message first approach does is it gives you a natural boundary to say, hey, this content that our sales team is asking for, yes, that aligns with the message that we're trying to put out into the market right now. That goes in the box. This other thing that the demand team is asking for, that doesn't really align with the message that we're trying to put out into the market. That's going to have to stay out of the box for right now. We'll talk about how to handle those conversations in just a moment. But the point being is that you sort of create a natural boundary to say what's in, what's out, what fits, what doesn't fit. That's one big benefit. The other thing is that it creates a filter, right? So you can say clearly, does this content sort of lend itself or align with the message that we're trying to put out there right now? Now, it might be more than one message. We'll get to that again in just a moment. But the point is that you have some way to sort of filter those requests and say, this fits, this doesn't. This type of content kind of fits in the box. This piece does not. And so we're creating some boundaries. We're creating some filters, and we're sort of creating a system and a process by which we can sort and manage and prioritize all of the requests and ideas that are undoubtedly floating around about how we should be doing content or what kind of content we should be making. So let's walk through the process here in sort of a realistic version of this. So the first thing that you want to do, right, is we need to identify one specific message that we're trying to put out to the market. Right now, I don't know what stage your company's at, but likely you have one sort of champion message or positioning statement or something that sort of resonates, that your team really tends to sort of gravitate to, about how you solve a problem, or whatever, what you wish everyone knew, or how you thought, or how you wish everyone thought about a specific problem, whatever that is, right? You've got one message. So we're going to start with that one message. In this case, right, let's just say I'm a content marketing agency. So my message is, hey, content shouldn't be treated like fast food. I'm not going to unpack all that, but that might be an idea of a message that I'm going to start with. Well, in most cases, you don't have one message, right? You have several different messages that are working on different audiences at different times, perhaps at different steps in the buyer journey or the funnel. And so what we want to do then is we want to take that message and we want to scale that out. We want to just figure out, okay, what are all the messages? What are the messages that we want to put out into the market? What do we want people to know or to take away, or to think about? And so you might have, let's say you've got 3 messages like I'm showing here. Each of those messages is basically like its own bucket, right? Its own filter, as we looked at in the previous graphic. And so what we want to do then is we want to start sorting some of the content topics or ideas or keywords or requests into these buckets, right? Which buckets do they fit into? Do they fit into any of these buckets? If they don't, let's keep them to the side, right? The point here is that we're starting to organize the content, ideas, requests, keywords, etc., around these themes. And what that's doing again is sort of providing some boundaries and some filters. So we can sort of say what's in, what's out, where does it fit, where does it not fit. Um, the next step here is where things I think get really interesting, right? Is that first of all, you've got all these messages. That's great. That on its own works to some level to say, hey, this fits, that doesn't. But you can also take that one step further and say, well, what if we also build a cadence around this, right? We're not going to always put the same message out into the market at the same time. We have different messages that we want to put out. Now, some of these might align with cyclical things that happen in your industry or specific campaigns that you have coming up or events that you're attending, whatever it is, right? We want to put some structure around these messages. So ideally, not only do we have a series of messages where we're aligning our content to a specific high level message that we're trying to put out into the market, but we also have a schedule or a cadence for when those messages are most relevant and most important that we put them out. So now we can say, hey, in Q1, we're focused on these two messages that we want to push out to our core audience. And within those buckets, any content that kind of fits in that window is a potential for something that we're going to create in Q1. Now, when we start thinking about this third bucket of how AI will change how we value content, that comes in Q2. If you've got a content request that aligns with that message, that's great. But it's probably not something that we're going to be able to prioritize until Q2 because that's when that's a priority for us. So what you're doing again, you're creating those boundaries, you're creating those filters, and you are focusing your content marketing efforts, right? Because the other challenge, the sort of meta thing that we're trying to avoid here is dilution. Okay, so more content, more channels, more formats sounds great, but the problem is that you flood the market with a bunch of mediocre content that doesn't really say anything. It's not aligned around a key message, and your audience loses the thread, right? It doesn't. It becomes gobbledygook after so long. And so what this does is it gives us some focus. It allows us to focus our strategy and our effort internally, but also the message. It allows us to focus the message that we're putting out to the market and really make an impact with that message rather than dripping it out over the course of a year. Okay, so that's one thing. The key with this, right, is that it gives you a way to say no, basically, right? So as a content leader, I know that you probably don't feel comfortable saying no to requests, right? If your sales team comes to you and says, "Hey, we need that one pager," in most organizations, it's not okay to just be like, "No, we're not doing that," right? For a myriad political reasons, we won't unpack all the psychological underpinnings of that, but the key is that it gives you a sort of softer version of that, right? So in this case, using this framework, if somebody comes to you and they say, "Hey, I need this blog post," you can say, "Hey, I'd love to write that for you, but right now we're focused on these messages and these buckets. We're going to focus on something that I think is a better fit for that in Q2. So it's not no, but it's not right now. Right now, that doesn't align with our priorities. So again, it gives you kind of a structure and a strategy and some framework to really sort, filter, block those requests and create a more reasonable expectation around the content output. A couple of quick things here. We're not going to go all the way into how to build a messaging framework. We don't have time for that in this stream, but a couple of high level things that I've found to be really helpful here. So number one is this idea of mirroring the market. So this is just a really simple workflow where basically, you go out, you talk to your ICP, you sort of capture some of their pain points, you reflect that message back to the market, you repeat that process, right? So that gives you an idea of what's happening in my market right now, what are people thinking about, what are they worried about, and how do we put out a message that aligns with that. You can use this as sort of a way to gut check and to sort of litmus test the things that you're putting out into the market, get really quick feedback. The next thing you can do is you can mine your existing content. So first of all, I'll say I'm always an advocate of talking to your ICP, talking to your audience. I think people way undervalue just having a 30-minute conversation. But if for some reason that's really a significant barrier, then what you can do is you can use your existing content and your sort of history of content as a proxy. So you can look at the content that's been most successful, analyze that content, try to identify what are some of the key messages here, perhaps what really seemed to resonate most with our audience based on what was most successful, and then use that to kind of repackage it into a messaging framework. The third thing here, which I know is a barrier for many teams, but I'll include it anyway, is good old fashioned market research, doing surveys, focus groups, that kind of stuff. Again, I know most teams probably don't have the resources or the budget to go out and engage in sort of old fashioned traditional market research or messaging research, but that's obviously an option as well to really dial in what are the messages that we're putting out and when are we putting them out. I think that's the other component. That's the other variable here. Okay, so that's great. That gives you one way to do this, but that still doesn't slow down the hours and hours and hours that you probably are spending fielding content requests and saying no and explaining why you can't do the things and creating all of these having all these communications just to try to create some sort of sanity around the content that your team is expected to own. So how do we think about content requests, and how do we use content requests as actually a strategic tool rather than a fire hose that's always blasting at us? So we're going to talk about right now is the idea of like reducing mental load. Okay, so this is sort of a big picture thing that I think a lot of people don't talk about for content leaders, right? Is that all of that mental work around how do I respond to people? How do I say no to my CEO about this blog post? Or how do I come up with some creative way to get out of doing this thing that I know doesn't make sense with our strategy? That is like a tax, right? We're paying that tax every day working with teams because we're constantly being bombarded with these requests, and we have to figure out how to navigate these mentally heavy processes and conversations. And so the first thing that we should talk about is that order taking is the opposite of strategy, right? So this is what the content process actually looks like inside most teams that I've talked to, which is that there really isn't much of a strategy, right? There's some strategic elements, and then there's a fire hose of content requests. And the content leader is basically just trying their best to not drown, and then when they have time, trying to figure out how do I prioritize these things that people are asking me for. So you're constantly being inundated with, let's start a podcast. Why aren't we on TikTok? We need this one pager. Can you write a blog post? Whatever, right? All these requests. What we want to do is we want to turn this into some kind of a strategy. How do we actually take all of these requests and orders and say, actually, we have a strategy, we have a process, and your requests need to fit within that strategy? And how do we sort of flip that process so that it works for us rather than against us? The meta solution here is offloading the guesswork, right? So the other part of the mental work that's being done here is that a lot of times what you're getting is a half-baked idea about a blog post, and then it's up to you as the content leader, as the content team, to figure out like, wait, why are we making this? What's the point of this? What are we trying to say with this message, right? So you're getting sort of these half-baked ideas that you're expected to then turn into something useful and valuable. Well, let's not, right? let's try to reverse that process. So the first thing that's so essential here, if you don't already have it, is that you need a formal request process. It's usually a form, right? A type form, a paper form, a Google form, whatever it is. It's some way that people can submit requests in an orderly, standardized, and structured way. Okay. Again, if you don't already have this as part of your process, like that's step zero. Start there, build a form, make it as simple as you possibly can to start. That's totally fine. But just have some lever, some way to control how those requests are coming to you. Otherwise, as I'm sure you already know, you have a million pings coming from Slack and messages in your email and, requests all over the place, right? And it's a mess. And again, you're creating so much mental work just trying to wrangle those requests that it's eating so much of your time and mental energy. So that's step one. Get the request form in place if you don't already have it. But let's think about what that request form actually does. Let's think about that as a strategic function. Okay. So, what is in that request form, and how can we use that request form to our advantage? So, some of the things that we can ask for in that it as part of a content request is first and foremost, what is the strategic direction of this piece that you're requesting? Why do we actually need this? What what goals does it support? How is it going to be used, right? So again, rather than us guessing based on some, you know, 3-word request that got sent to us in a Slack DM, we're saying, hey, go fill out the form where you have to do some of that mental work up front to clarify what you're requesting. The second piece here is goal clarity. So a similar function, right? We want to know what success looks like. And we want you to tell us that before we put effort into making this thing. Because again, otherwise we're guessing. We're guessing at what success looks like. Inevitably, we're going to be wrong probably 50% of the time, if not more, right? So getting that clarity from the person who's making the request is huge, huge benefit. The third thing is messaging alignment. We'll talk a little bit about how this works with the first component, but there's a huge opportunity here to also bake in this message alignment question. So, how does this request align with the things that are currently a priority? Or if it doesn't, then which priorities does it potentially align with that come in the future? So again, what we're doing already, we've already created sort of 3 different filters, right? So we've created 3 different layers of information that we don't have to guess about, and that we're asking other people to provide up front before we sort of take their request seriously. Again, I know that this is not always going to be the case. Maybe your CEO is, going to fight you tooth and nail on doing this themselves, and they just want to send you a Slack DM. I'm not going to get into arguing with your CEO, but you should. But the more important thing is that if you have the majority of the people on your team using a system or a process like this, it's going to be a game changer, right? It's going to be a huge game changer. So again, the request form does not have to be crazy. It does not have to be some super sophisticated process. But the beauty of it is that you get to control how complex it is, and we'll talk a little bit about how that comes into play in just a moment. But it doesn't have to. It also doesn't have to be static, right? So you can update this form at different times in your in the life cycle throughout the year as you get more requests, as you get fewer requests, as you discover you need more information or you need less information, whatever it is, you can adjust this and use this form not just as a way to collect information, but actually as a strategic tool. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but this is just to give you an idea of how simple this request form can be, while still collecting a lot of very valuable information that creates a little bit of friction. By the way, creates a little bit of friction for everyone else. And I think that's okay, right? Our goal here isn't to get the most content requests. Our goal is to get the best content requests. And a good content request requires a little bit of mental work. And that's okay. I think that's an acceptable price for someone to pay to get put in a request and have a piece of your time and your resources and your budget. Um, so, by the way, this is a template from the Paperform library. I think I did a little bit of customization just to kind of align the questions with some of the stuff we've been discussing here. But Paperform is a great tool if you don't use it. But again, you're not, Typeform, Google Forms, whatever works. There's no right answer here. The real beauty comes in what are you asking for in that form, and how does it work for you strategically. So again, in this case, it's not no, like you're not saying no to people's content requests. You're saying we need some more clarity before we can prioritize this. Can you fill out the form, right? And again, maybe that creates a little bit of friction. Maybe in some cases those requests never come in because you created a little bit of friction. It was a fleeting thought, or a nice to have, and not something that's really valuable or strategically aligned with the priorities of the team and the business. So that little bit of friction can make a big difference, just at a high level in terms of the volume that you receive. But the other thing is that, again, we can use it as a strategic tool. So how do we control the volume? Let's say we're getting 1,000 requests a month or whatever. 1,000 might be an exaggeration, but the point being, we're getting a ton of requests. How do we sort of dial in the number so that it's more reasonable and more uh, better aligns with our capacity and our resources, right? So you can control the volume by adjusting those required fields. So adding more fields, making the fields more detailed, more nuanced, asking for more information. However, you sort of tackle that. There's a value in that, right? You're getting more value from those requests, which is helpful. But B,
you're also controlling the friction, right? So you're creating more friction, which means that you're likely to get fewer of those requests in the first place. So it works in sort of both ways. Again, you can specify the inputs. So let's say you get into this, you roll out this content request form. By the end of Q1, you're like, this didn't really help. Like we still had to do a bunch of guesswork. We had to chase down a bunch of information that wasn't included. Add that to the form, right? You just add it to the form. You figure out what that information is, what's missing, what's eating up our team's mental bandwidth, and how do we reduce that? How do we get them to focus on the work that they're being paid to do, and not all of the administrative and mental burden that comes with trying to figure out some vague content request. The third thing kind of goes hand in hand with that, which is that it allows you to collect resources. How much time does your team spend chasing down docs and finding recordings and doing all of these like tiny administrative and mental gymnastics just to get the information they need to start writing an article or to start on some project? Collect those resources as part of the form. You're going to immediately reduce the amount of overhead and work that comes with that for your team. And then the final thing is, again, kind of the meta benefit here, which is offloading that mental work. So why are we guessing? Why are we guessing about what this blog post should be? The request needs to be more clear up front. We need to get that information and that direction and that clarity around how does this align with our strategy? What does success look like? We shouldn't be guessing about that. So that's how we use this form as sort of a strategic tool, not just a way to collect information, but an actual filter and a funnel. I mean, I think the other thing to keep in mind here is that this is not just for your benefit. It's actually going to benefit the output as well, right? Both because you have more time and focus and energy to put towards the work, and because you're going to have more clarity up front. So you're going to waste fewer time. You're going to waste less time going around in circles, doing revisions, putting out stuff that maybe doesn't quite hit the mark of what that person was expecting because they didn't give you any information to start. So it's going to level up the whole process. Um, One final note here, which is that I mentioned this alignment between the messaging first framework and the request form. One of the things that we've seen here that really tends to work is that you can put some of those key messages directly in the form, right? So have somebody select which of these messages or these campaigns does this align with or does it support. If it doesn't support any of these, hey, that's great. We can add it to our queue, but it's going to be way at the bottom because that's not a priority right now, right? So you can align both of these two things and sort of create, a serious gating effect here around what are we going to focus on and when and in what order. So that's how those two things can potentially work together. So the the last thing that we're going to talk about is, hey, look, that's all great, but even if I cut my requests by 50%, I still own 1,000 different channels that I need to support, and all of them need content. How do I possibly keep up with all of these different things, even if I'm doing fewer big pieces, and I still need to chop it up into a million small parts, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about now is how to deal with that. And so this is a sort of operational system, I think is maybe the best way to put it, or kind of a workflow that we've used with a lot of our clients, that we've seen work with a lot of other teams, which I'm sort of colloquially calling anchors and hooks. And so this is basically a system for how do you build that multi-channel or omni-channel strategy without just burying yourself in constant in constant work. And again, no, the solution is not just feed everything to AI and have it churn out 20 LinkedIn posts. It's more sophisticated than that, and I think better is going to lead to a better outcome. So first of all, let's define what these two components are. So number one is an anchor. So the anchor is like the strategic grounding for your content marketing strategy. We've already talked about one potential way that you anchor your strategy, which is through the messaging. So having those messages be an anchor gives you some clarity and some focus and a way to kind of filter requests. But beyond that, we can also think about sort of what are like the anchor pieces within our strategy. So even if you're creating all this different type of content within these different types of or for these different formats and different channels, likely one piece is sort of or one of those things is sort of your anchor. So whether it's a blog post or a pillar post or a quarterly report that you publish or whatever, there's sort of one piece that is kind of the grounding force for your strategy, and everything else tends to be kind of built around that. Now, for a lot of teams, it's blog posts. That's totally fine. If it's just a blog post, it doesn't have to be anything magnificent or crazy. Other teams, it's a podcast, right? Hey, we started the podcast, we record the podcast episode. That's our anchor piece. Everything else stems from that. That is totally fine. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's whatever works best for your team. Um, I actually wrote an article about this where I was like, hey, writing blog posts for our website on the Optimus website doesn't really make that much sense strategically. It's not like the highest leverage channel for us, but from a workflow and operations perspective, uh, it gives us a center of gravity that we can hold on to, and it works within our current workflow. So we're going to keep doing it, even if it's not the most ideal operation or maybe the most efficient process. Having that anchor is still valuable because it allows the rest of the workflow to sort of build on top of it. So the second component here is what we were calling hooks. These are basically like natural intersections for scaling your multi-channel strategy. Okay, we'll look at this in a lot more detail here in just a moment when we talk about how this works in practice. But some ideas for what this might look like is let's say your anchor is a blog post, right? The visuals that go into that blog post could be a hook that feed into other channels, right? So you could take the visuals from your blog and repurpose them or reuse them for other channels. Maybe it's your narrative structure, right? So maybe it's like your headlines. The headlines could feed into some other format or channel that kind of uh, follows from that anchor content. Or it could be the data points. Hey, we're going to take every data point that's in our blog post and we're going to turn it into an interesting visual that we share on LinkedIn, right? That could be part of your strategy, right? And so the whole idea here is that the anchors are sort of the central hub. That's the main sort of hero content that you're going to create, and then the hooks are all these like little built-in components of that anchor content that feed the multi-channel strategy. Now, a couple things that we'll talk about what this looks like, and then I want to clarify a couple things here because this is not the same as just like a simple repurposing strategy. It's a little bit more, again, more complicated, but more valuable, I think, than that. So let's look at the real world example first. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to start really simple, right? Do not over engineer this on day one or it's going to immediately fall apart. So let's just say, again, we've got a blog post. In that blog post, there are images. Those images can then be turned into Instagram posts. Very simple process. Probably seems extremely obvious, and you might already be doing some version of this. That's great. How do we take that up a notch, right? So the next step is to start building in more hooks. Okay, so think about the form factor of your original anchor piece, this blog post, right? What are some of the other components of that again sort of lend themselves or feed into other channels, other formats that your team is also trying to create? So one example might be, hey, we're going to take all the headings and we're going to turn that into a narrative structure that we use to make a carousel. Okay, so we're not making a carousel from scratch and we're not just copy and pasting the content from our blog post into a carousel, but we are using a component, the headings, to give us structure and direction for what that carousel might look like. Another idea might be like we already talked about. Hey, we're going to take the data, every data point in this blog post, we're going to turn into a data visual, and that might be something that we, I don't know, use in our email campaigns or we post on Instagram or whatever we do with it. Right? We can do different things with those visuals, but we're going to make sure that we create an interesting visual out of every data point that we use in our blog post. Okay, so that those are the hooks, right? So this is the anchor, and these are the hooks. Now the thing that really gets interesting here, first of all, is that as we're creating this anchor content, we need to be thinking multi-channel, right? So when you're writing these headings, we need to be thinking about how do they work for this article, but also how do they feed into the carousel that we're going to create from these headings, right? And so it sort of forces a little bit of additional thought, but then you're starting from a much richer place when you go to sit down to make that carousel, right? You've already put the thought and the strategy into crafting this as part of the anchor content. And so it's no longer, just, hey, we got this blog post out. How do we turn this thing into a carousel, right? It's already been sort of thought through and mapped out as part of the creative process. Now, what you can do from there is you can get even more sophisticated. Okay. So you can start to then combine those things, let's say, right? So maybe, hey, we create these carousels and these data visuals, and now we're going to start stitching those together and turning those into motion graphics, right? So there's sort of an infinite amount of complexity that you can build off of this. But you have to have that system, and that structure, and that workflow in place, right? Again, it's about the workflow. How do we build this content in such a way that leads to these without just saying, hey, every time we make a blog post, we're also going to make a carousel, but actually saying we're going to take this specific component from this anchor content, and then we're going to turn it into this other format. That's really the key here. So again, I hate thinking of this as like repurposing, because I feel like that has like these very negative and frankly lazy connotations around, taking content and just kind of copy and pasting it into a different box. But a couple things that I'll clarify here. Number one is this is not content promotion. Okay, so we're not the goal here is not to make a carousel to get people to click a link to go back to the original blog post. My opinion, what I'm seeing in the space right now is that that's an outdated model, right? That used to be the way that we did things. We would write a blog post, and then we would make a bunch of LinkedIn posts that all try to drive traffic back to our blog post. If you've got to do that, you got to do that. But the better way, in my opinion, my experience, is to decouple this sort of secondary content from the primary content. We're not using it to promote the original piece. We're just using the original piece, the anchor piece, as an entree into the secondary content. The secondary content needs to be native content that's purpose built for that channel, right? So it's a carousel built for maximum engagement on LinkedIn. It's not a carousel built to just as sort of a weak advertisement for the full article. So that's one key thing. The second thing is what we've already talked about, which is making it multi-channel by design. So as we're sitting down to actually write this article or create the visuals or whatever it is, we need to be thinking about the different ways that it's going to be repurposed, and they need to be identified in advance, right? Otherwise, it's everything becomes ad hoc, and it's extremely messy. So if we know in advance we're going to take every visual in this blog post and turn it into an Instagram post, then your designers can design those visuals with those constraints in mind, and we can sort of create something that works for both levels, or we can at least create something that works within a system that works for both channels. The second thing is that we need to build our sort of content ops uh, around this, right? So again, whatever the steps are in your process, we need to be thinking about how does that process feed all of these different channels. So how does it kind of connect all of these dots in a way that we end up with kind of a package of assets rather than a single asset that we're trying to then carry through a bunch of different stages. The final thing is a modular workflow. So we've already talked a little bit about kind of how you can stack these different hooks on top of each other and build really complex multi-channel systems. The key with that is figuring out how each of these things feed into one another, and then creating kind of a library of these different workflows, right? So every maybe not every blog post is going to lead to motion graphic, but anytime we have a data visual and a carousel, those two things can come together into a motion graphic, right? So we want to be able to reuse these systems for different types of content. So that's how we start to really scale this process. So if we start with the blog post as our anchor, that's great. But what happens if we do a research report, right? How do we adjust that? Well, we could build a whole system from scratch, but if we already have these modular workflows, we can say, okay, well, what are the components of a research report, and what secondary assets do those components feed into? So it really gives us a way to, again, kind of scale the process, repeat it, and apply it to different types of content, different anchors, as well as those different secondary and even tertiary assets that we're creating. A couple of key things here. One, don't shortcut the process, right? So if you need a bunch of different components to make your motion graphics, don't try to jump straight from your blog post to your motion graphic, right? It's way easier to incrementally build towards it. Not to mention the fact that you end up with more assets. So rather than trying to kind of create something from nothing in so many words, build the sort of requisite components first and then compile that into your like final tertiary assets. Don't start from scratch, right? The whole point of this is that we're never trying to start from we're trying to never start from scratch. We all know that if you sit down and say, hey, let's just write a bunch of interesting LinkedIn carousels, that's a lot harder than if you're starting from some kind of source material or asset that already exists that you can repackage and kind of refine for that specific channel. So whenever possible, try not to start from scratch on those like secondary and tertiary things. And also don't work in reverse, right? This is one thing, you can build a workflow for this if that makes sense. But generally speaking, these workflows only really are designed to work in one direction. So, um, you know, you can't just necessarily flip the switch. There's just a lot of considerations, right? Going from a motion graphic to a blog post is a much different creative and strategic process than vice versa. So, don't just think that you can interchange these systems. Um, in this case, right, we can also use this as part of our sort of control mechanism for the content requests and the content queue. So somebody is coming to you and they're asking for a carousel, let's say, and it doesn't really align with anything that you're working on. Hey, it's not no, but we don't really have the source materials we need for this yet. We don't really have the sort of components that we would need to make this. Let's talk about how we sort of start this workflow at the very beginning, which, by the way, you need to submit a content request and work through the process so that we end up with this asset that you're asking us for. So again, it gives you kind of another mechanism, another lever to control that input and that output. So real quick, I'm just going to run through a kind of mini case study here of this last one in particular, which is DreamHost, one of our clients. So, DreamHost, I think, has a pretty robust content strategy that we help support their team with. Every month, we're producing 12 long form editorial pieces. Those pieces go out both in English and in Spanish. From those, we also create 48 unique visual assets, 12 motion graphics, and then that turns into 72 different social posts that get posted across 7 accounts. And again, 2 of those 7 accounts are also in Spanish. So there's a lot of repurposing, repackaging, optimizing different assets for different channels and different accounts, as well as translating, right? So there's a lot of like different steps here. And by the way, shout out to our team, shout out to Katie, our ops person who has sort of engineered the process here and really fine-tuned the workflows. But the point is that we use a system like this to make all of this possible, right? So how do we do all of this without going crazy and to keep the sort of system on pace, right? So we have a process. Our core content or our anchor content begins with the long form editorial. Again, that's not required. Maybe you're a podcast first or a video first kind of company. That's also fine. You got to start with something, right? You start with some kind of source material. From there, we're identifying visual opportunities. So we're translating the written content into visual content. So from the writing that's on the page, how do we actually translate that into something that works as a visual in general? Then we create direction for that, right? So we sit down, we actually map that out and say, okay, this seems like an interesting thing that would lend itself to a visual. What would that actually look like in practice? What direction should we give our designers to actually turn it into something visually interesting? Obviously, our designers are going to design. They do great work. Again, shout out to our designers. Then we do a review, right? So one key thing with this strategy, right, is that you want to make sure that you create your review steps in the right place so that you're not scaling things like mistakes, right? So if you wait till the end to review and you've created 12 different assets, and now you're reviewing everything, well, that means you got to fix something 12 times if you made a mistake. So review early in the process, proof stuff before you scale it out. Then you're going to scale it, right? So then you're going to create all of the assets, right? So maybe the second, let's say the secondary assets. In this case, right, our most immediate process is generally creating visual content for sort of the static images, static image posts that go out on like LinkedIn and Instagram for this client. And then we're going to extend that further, right? So then we're going to think about more advanced formats. So we also do things like reels and motion graphics as part of our engagement with DreamHost. And so, again, we're sort of repackaging and repurposing the core content into these more advanced formats. So that's our process. Again, not every process is going to look exactly the same, but just to give you an idea of kind of what the workflow actually looks like in practice. Um, we're creating this blog post, we're creating the sort of that first order or secondary like visual assets, which feed into the social content. And then again, from there, there's sort of another layer of, okay, how do we repackage that? How do we translate them into different languages? All of those things kind of come off the back of that initial strategy. But again, I just want to point out that the key thing here is that we're thinking about this at during the first step, right? So when we're designing these graphics, we're thinking about, is this going to work on Instagram? Is this going to work on LinkedIn? Is this going to work on X, etc. If you want to dig more into this, you can check out, we've got kind of a full write-up of like what our process actually looks like. Yesoptimist.com/dream engine. It's all one word. You can check out the breakdown there, and kind of learn a little bit more about what our process looks like, and maybe get some inspiration for your own. All right. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left. I'm going to pop over here to the chat. Hopefully, I haven't already gotten a bunch of questions that I have been ignoring. Sorry that for some reason the chat doesn't seem to be working here in the from the Riverside end of things. So I'm going to pop over here. Looks like I'm looking at LinkedIn. Um, Looks like a couple folks. Thanks for popping in here. Bhakti and Belinda and Katie. Thanks so much for popping in. Is this going? Hang on. I think I'm behind. Oh, okay. I think I'm maybe live now. Okay, yeah, it looks like it's still live. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to pop in here into the chat, and I'll try to get those answered. Aisha, hey, good to see you. Um, Cool. While we're waiting for those questions, first of all, I just want to say thanks so much to everyone for joining today. As I said, this was kind of my first run here with this particular like technical setup, so hopefully there were not too many technical challenges or glitches. Definitely need to sort out kind of the chat process here a little bit, but other than that, yeah, I really appreciate the support. As you can see on the screen here, a couple things. First of all, again, if you want to check out more about our workflow that we use with the DreamHost team in particular, you can go to yesoptimist.com/dream engine, all one word. That's going to take you to that write up and kind of the process that we use there. And of course, you can always reach out to me personally if you have any questions or you want to just talk shop or whatever. I'm at t@yesoptimist.com. Yeah, would love to hear from you. Finally, if you're not already connected on LinkedIn, definitely do so. Would love to connect with you on LinkedIn as well, and just stay connected there. Um, cool. Well, I don't see any questions. I see some clapping. Thank you for the claps, Jasmine, and the wave from Samuel. Thanks, guys. Well, appreciate everyone hanging out today. I guess we'll wrap things up here. But if you do have any questions or anything that I can help with, as I said, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Feel free to drop me an email. Otherwise, thanks again so much, y'all. Great to see you, and hope to see you again soon. Cheers.